I'm about to drive 500 laps around the fastest track on the F1 game on a controller. Your average Saudi Arabian Grand Prix lasts for 50 laps, and in this video I'm going to try and not go crazy by driving exactly 10 of these. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, I'm also trying to get into the top 10% in the world on a track that almost made me lose my mind. So my first lap was unsurprisingly absolutely rubbish, but that was to be expected because I hadn't driven around Saudi Arabia in almost 3 months when I tried to beat 0% AI with only one gear. Yeah, so that video really didn't help me at all, especially trying to learn the braking points. Anyway, for a first lap, I actually had quite a good run through turn 4, however I wasn't quite able to hook up turn 5 as I ran a little wide. After this, turn 6 wasn't great, but turn 7 was pretty good, and then turn 8 and 9 were a mess, but in my opinion turn 10, 11 and 12 were pretty decent for a first lap. And honestly, I cannot complain considering I still had 499 laps to improve. Next up was turn 13, and I had a really nice entry to the corner, but I probably accelerated a little too early and then had a pretty big wobble which I just about saved. Now we're at turn 16, and to be honest, for a first lap I honestly think I took it pretty well as I didn't really make any mistake. We are now on the straight that leads you up to turn 22, and for me this corner was the hardest on the track by an absolute mile, and I must have crashed into the barriers at 22 at least 80 times across the 500. And the next braking zone was the final corner. I actually had a half decent entry to the final corner, but on the exit I was in the wrong gear and had another wobble. I then crashed into the wall, which frustratingly gave me an invalidated lap time, but thankfully I had 499 left to make up for it. By the end of the first lap I set a lap time that was good enough for the top 92% in the world, and after this I just couldn't stop improving. And throughout my first 50 lap stint I made constant improvements, so much so that by the end of the stint I had made my way into the top 60% in the world. And at this point I was confident that I could achieve the overall goal of getting into the top 10% in the world. So it took me a while to get to my next improvement, but during my second stint on lap 90 I finally improved again. This improvement only gained me 2% in the world, but it reminded me of where I could find time on this lap, and this was so useful, as you're about to find out. So on lap 94 the first massive news was that I learned I could cut turn 1 so much more than I thought I could, and I mean just have a look at how much time I gained on the exit. I went from being a tenth down to 2.3 tenths up, which was absolutely massive. And now we're coming into the hard part of this first sector, but to be honest, looking back at this was the first time that I properly hooked up this section. I seem to have a very clean run through every corner, and I finished the first sector a massive half a second up. We'll quickly go through turn 13 as it's a very long and slow corner, but I did improve through it by 3 tenths, so now I was 8 tenths up and I knew I was on a potentially massive lap. I then improved again by another 2 tenths through turn 16 to 18, and I was now a second up, which I maintained all the way to the final corner. Through the final corner I only gained 800ths of a second, but it was progress nonetheless. In the end I gained a massive second and I moved into the top 46% in the world, and I genuinely started to think that the challenge was actually possible. Sadly, that was all the progress I made for the second stint, but in 100 laps I'd gone from the top 92% in the world to the top 46%, so I definitely can't complain. And I started off the third stint really well. On lap 160 I finally used third gear through the final corner, and I went from being 1.4 tenths up to 2.4 tenths up. For where I was in the world this wasn't actually a lot of time, but this somehow gained me 5% worth of progress, and I was now into the top 40% in the world. 14 laps later and I was once again improving. On lap 128 I was 6.3 tenths up coming into turn 22, but I missed the apex by a mile, and this cost me a massive 3 tenths. Annoyingly, I couldn't make up for this progress in the final corner, and I moved into the top 38% in the world, but this could have been so much more. So that was the end of my third stint, but to be honest I think it went pretty well. I made 3 improvements with at least 3 tenths to find in just one corner, and I knew that there was also time to find everywhere else. And one of the places to find time was at turn 16 to 18. On lap 206 I made a 2 tenth gain through these corners, which I maintained to the end of the lap, and once again with the small improvement I made massive progress, which was worth 7%. Worryingly though, this was the only bit of progress I made in this entire stint, and I just seemed to hit a bit of a plateau. So at this point I decided that it was time to take a day off, and after this see if I was actually just washed or if I could actually make any more progress. And guess what? I was just washed. From laps 200 to 250 I didn't make any progress and just kept invalidating, spinning out or crashing. Here's my 250th lap, but at this point I knew that I had to switch something up if I wanted to make any more progress. So what I decided to change was the time setting from being at midnight to midday. Looking back I'm basically certain that this was a lucky guess at the fact that it might, and this is a big might, help with my visibility. However, I didn't know that this lucky guess was arguably the most important change that I made of this entire challenge. So my first improvement of the new setting was on lap 17, which was a very small 1/10 gain, which only moved me up 1% in the world, but progress is progress. And then 4 laps later I made a 4/100th improvement, which unsurprisingly didn't move me up anywhere in the world. Anyway, we're now on to arguably the second most important lap of this entire challenge. Coming into turn 13 I was a 10th up, but this time I didn't drop dropped down to 3rd gear, and this increase in traction in 4th meant that I gained a full 10. So the next proper corner was turn 16, and I knew there was loads of time to find on the exit. To be honest, my entry to 16 wasn't that great, but I did make loads of progress on the exit, so now I was 3/10 up halfway through the lap. I then gained a little bit of time on the run up to turn 22, but I knew there was even more to find on the exit of this corner. I tapped the wall on the entry, however I had such a good exit and I gained a massive 2/10. Next up was the final corner, where once again there was time to find. I seemed to find all of the time on the entry to the corner, which was another 2/10, which I maintained all the way to the end of the lap. In the end, I set my first sub 1 minute 28 lap time, which isn't quite as fast as my video last weekend. However, this huge 7/10 improvement put me into the top 18% in the world. I'll be honest, at this point I was absolutely buzzing because I was certain that there was some time to find, and if I could just find some of this time I would definitely make it into the top 10% in the world. And then very early into my 7th stint I once again made a small bit of progress with time to find in turn 22 and the final corner. And I found a lot of this time 25 laps later. Coming into turn 22 I was a 10th up, and even though I left time to find on the entry to the corner, I gained a lot on my previous personal best on the exit. I was now coming into the final turn 2.8 tenths up. I basically had a perfect run through this corner, which as you can see gained me a massive 4/100ths of a second, and I made a huge 5% jump in progress. I straight away went to have a look at the leaderboard, and I knew that with 170 laps remaining I could definitely set a top 10% in the world lap time. Unsurprisingly, I didn't beat this lap time on this stint, but one thing was for sure: if I could just have a better entry and nail the exit out of turn 22, I might just be able to find the time to get into the top 10% in the world. However, there was a problem. Throughout my next stint I made so many mistakes before turn 22 and I didn't make a single improvement. I now had only 100 laps to go, and I knew that I just had to set one exceptional lap time that could potentially see me achieve my goal.
She ran away in her sleep, dreamed of paradise, paradise. Every time she closed her eyes. Expected the world, but it flew away from her reach, and the bullets catching her teeth. Life goes on, it gets so heavy, the wheel breaks the butterfly. Every tear a waterfall in the night, the stormy night. She closed her eyes.
This is it. This is the lap of the weekend.
I had done it. In the end, I scraped into the top 10% in the world, and although the lap was far from perfect, I had achieved my goal, and that was good enough for me. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't really try and beat this lap after this, as I was desperate to get this video out in time. And if you're watching this an hour after the Grand Prix is finished, leave a like, because I've probably been up the previous night at 3 AM editing this video. Thank you all for watching, and go and check out my other 500 lap videos.